All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to AS221. Today we're going to be talking about weather reports, forecasts, and charts for Unit 27. This should be a pretty straightforward lesson. It should go by pretty quick because for the most part this should be review. At this point in your training, everything we're going to talk about you should have talked about in your private pilot ground school. So hopefully this is review. Hopefully a lot of this information you're very comfortable with. And if not, then maybe you'll know where there are areas that you need to continue to study those materials. So as an overview, we'll give an introduction, then we'll talk about pre-flight weather sources and products, and we'll talk about in-flight weather sources. Pretty straightforward. As an objective, the student will interpret meteorological reports and forecasts, identify meteorological hazards, assess risk related to meteorological hazards, and make an accurate and timely go, no-go decision. Airman Certification Standards, ACS, we are in task 1B. This is pre-flight information, weather information. I'm sure you guys can, if you're curious, you can take the time to go over that information. Essentially, you have to understand the weather, especially remember 91.103. We will talk about this in a minute, but remember that you are legally required to make yourself aware of all information pertaining to your flight before you go flying. So if you go on a cross country, that means you have to be aware of all of the potential information related to that flight, including, very much including, weather. So that's kind of what this is getting at with these two pages here. References, Instrument Flying Handbook, Instrument Procedures Handbook, and the AIM. And we will specifically talk about weather references in just a moment. So here are some more general references for you to look at, and then we're going to talk about weather specific references in just a moment. All right, so today, again, we're going to be discussing pre-flight weather information and sources as well as products, and in-flight weather information. So pre-flight weather information, we have flight services available to us. So we'll talk about the different ways you can be briefed on the weather. There's aviationweather.gov, which gets its information from the National Oceanic. I forgot what the two A's stand for. I'm drawing a blank right now. Sorry. But anyway, NOAA is our big weather organization, and they provide aviation weather for us, as well as we'll discuss the uses of ForeFlight when it comes to weather and filing and getting a brief. And then we'll talk about in-flight weather sources. Again, flight services, HIWAS, ATIS, ASOS, and AWOS, as well as the data link in your aircraft. All things weather information is in terms of what you need to know. There's two great FAA books out there. There's the Aviation Weather Handbook, and this is your general explanation of weather. So I would highly recommend that you have a copy of this. Again, you can always download any FAA textbooks for free. If you just Google AC00-6 Bravo, you can find that, and I would recommend downloading that. ForeFlight, in case you didn't know, this is kind of a tangent, but ForeFlight, you have the ability to download any kind of document that you want. So hopefully you've learned this cool tool by now. The FAA has their own folder, so all of the FAA documents are already in here. So I'm pretty sure if we go into handbooks, scroll down. Yep, here is aviation weather. So it's already kind of pre-installed into your ForeFlight. So if you're using ForeFlight, you already have access to these documents. What's really nice is you can see I just clicked on a link and it brought me to what I want to read about. So great resources. They're not the most interesting reads. They can be hard to get through sometimes, but these are great primary sources when it comes to learning about weather information. So that is a place that you can always go to get these documents. So the Aviation Weather Handbook, again, gives you a general explanation of weather, while the Aviation Weather Services Handbook gives you an explanation of weather products. So understanding the weather is very important, but being able to understand the weather products, that is what is most practical to us as pilots. So that is AC00-45 Hotel. And again, that is in ForeFlight. That's this book here. So you just scroll through it. Let's say there's a particular weather product that you are curious about, you want to read up on or become more familiar with. You can just find it in the table of contents, such as the METAR here. Oops, didn't want to do that. Press the wrong link. So at the very bottom of the page, you can see the METAR. I click on that and it brings me to the section that begins discussing the METAR. So I can scroll through and it'll explain, all of the different things that I need to know about a METAR. Very useful tool. So if you have your iPad, if you have ForeFlight, download those two documents. So that way you always have that information on hand. All right, let's talk about flight service stations, FSS. By now, you should know there are lots of ways we can work with a flight service station. So as of right now, we're talking about pre-flight services. So these are things that you would do before you're in the airplane. So the first thing you can do is call them at 1-800-WEATHER-BRIEF. Hopefully by now you probably have this experience. If you have, depending on where maybe you've finished your private pilot flight course. So maybe you have your ticket, you're a rated private pilot, or maybe you're still progressing through that course while you've started instrument ground school. Either way is fine, but hopefully by now you've flown a cross country and your flight instructor has had you call 1-800-WEATHER-BRIEF to file and brief your flight. So you call them and they give you, right, you give them your flight plan and then they brief you on the weather. So they give you all pertinent weather information. So that's one method. Telephone is one method. Hopefully you've experienced that. I think it's really good practice to actually call someone and actually talk to them on the phone. I know it's not as convenient as the other method, but I think you should definitely take the time and try that someday if you haven't. The next method is 1-800-WEATHERBRIEF.com, and that's on the internet. We can actually click on this link if my internet will work. Here we go. And it looks like it wants me to log in, but I don't have an account right now, so I can't do that. Maybe go to desktop site. Here we go. So same thing, you can fill out a flight plan in 1-800-WEATHERBRIEF.com, and then you can file and brief it, and it will give you your briefing. It will give you all of the information you need about your flights. So this is a great method for getting your weather briefing as well as filing your flight plan. It's convenient. As we know, hold on, sorry. Press the wrong side of the screen. So as you also know, this same function works within ForeFlight. If you create a flight plan, so kind of a wonky flight plan. If you create a flight plan in ForeFlight, so let's say we go KPRC. Let's just go down to Tucson, make it simple. Okay, so let's say this is our route that we're going to do, or our destination. We can just pick a route. So I've created my flight plan. I can actually file this flight plan. You can download all of the important information, weather, air segments, TFRs, all of the information along the way, and then you can file. So you press on that button. I'm trying to remember where the file button is. I think they updated it since the last time I did it. Oh yeah, send to flights, and then you can proceed to file down here in the bottom right-hand corner. And you can get your briefing. So you can see how fast I created a flight plan, just chose pre-created routes, and it gave me my briefing. So this is another method that you can use to file and get a briefing, is using ForeFlight. So super convenient. We have gotten to a point where filing and briefing is super convenient. That being said, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't do it. Okay, so because it's made so easy, every time you go on a flight, you should be filing and briefing. And I say that kind of from the perspective of a VFR pilot. As an IFR pilot, you always have to file and brief. You don't have an option. But kind of just speaking to the VFR side of things, you should always file and brief if you are going on a cross country. Remember, I mentioned earlier 91-103. This is the legal requirements for pre-flight. You have to make yourself aware of all pertinent weather information. So that being said, when you file a flight plan and you get a briefing, that a part of that, you are complying with 91-103. So you're complying with that CFR there. And more importantly is when you call flight services or you file through your flight or through ForeFlight, now there is a record that you've done it. I've, at various times, whether I was in school or out of school, I've read accident reports, and when a pilot crashes, especially when it's weather related, the NTSB, they will go very in depth in investigating whether or not you complied with 91-103. One accident report I read said, they actually went through the pilot's cell phone. They checked the history on his computer to make sure, did this guy actually check the weather before he went flying, because he'd flown into IMC and crashed. So they wanted to make sure that he complied with 91-103. So by doing these things, you are leaving a breadcrumb trail in case something goes wrong. Let's say you're out flying one day and you fly into IMC unintentionally, and you crash. They're going to investigate you and see, did you do your due diligence? Did you do your job and brief on the weather? And so by doing that's why I talk about this, because by doing this, you're complying with 91-103 and you're leaving a record of it. So keep that in mind. As an IFR pilot, if you go on an IFR flight plan, you have to file, you have to brief. There's no way around that. So kind of more speaking to VFR flight plans. You can also sign up for a service called Adverse Condition Alerting Service, or ACAS. This is a service. You give them your email, your cell phone number, other methods of communication like satellite radio, and so you would file a flight plan, and anytime there are major changes to the weather or adverse conditions, you will get an alert via any of these options. So they can call you, they can text you, they can email you, and update you on the weather. So that's a really cool service that you should consider if you're doing a lot of IFR flying. So that way, maybe you file a flight plan, you're driving to the airport, they give you those updates so that you're well aware of the weather. Other services, so we talked about ACAS a little bit. You can get Surveillance Enhanced Search and Rescue. So long story short here, this is, you can get some additional equipment where they monitor either monitor position reports, or they monitor your kind of like your GPS movement, so that when there is no movement, they automatically can respond. They can automatically send search and rescue to find you. Because traditionally, with just say flight following, or flight services, when you file your flight plan with flight services, they simply wait to see, did you make it back to your location when you said you would. So there's a potentially a long period of time before they would realize that you're actually missing. But with this service, they would immediately be able to identify that something is wrong and be able to send emergency services to you. Next, let's talk about aviationweather.gov. Pretty simple. At this point, you should be very familiar with aviationweather.gov. This is kind of our primary source, or one of the primary sources, for a lot of these different weather products that we use. The METAR, surface observations, wind, weather depictions, constant pressure charts, radars, PIREPs, as well as forecasts such as the TAF, winds and temperatures aloft, graphical area forecast, airmet sigmets, convective sigmets, and low-level significant weather prognostic. Okay, same information that you learned in Private Pilot. So you should be familiar with this information, and this is a good opportunity if maybe, like a lot of us, if when it came to this knowledge or this section in your Private Pilot training, you kind of just skimmed by, got learned what you needed to know to pass your knowledge test, to pass your check ride. The weather doesn't change. It's you're always going to have to deal with weather when you fly. So being very familiar with a website like aviationweather.gov is going to be very important to your career. Being able to read what the weather is doing and understand, so that you are always well prepared. As you know, websites like this are easily replaced by ForeFlight. So there isn't like a need for you to go to that website and learn all of that information, because a lot of it is just presented through ForeFlight. So you can turn on, radar. You can turn on flight categories, so you can see, what the weather is like around the country. See where things are IFR. See where things are VFR. So these tools are here to make, again, weather a lot easier to figure out. So just by turning on a few features in ForeFlight, I can see that the northern United States has a massive thunderstorm going through it right now. And I can see, other than that, most of the Southwest is VFR. So if I were to go flying today would be a good day to go flying. So again, everything that's in aviationweather.gov is kind of brought to you in ForeFlight. So there isn't like a huge need for you to go to this website and know how to use it, but it is kind of our primary source for aviation weather. So even if you're not flying every day, what I would suggest is that you have a maybe just a habit of, maybe every morning or at some point during the day, going on to Aviation Weather or going on to ForeFlight and just giving yourself a weather brief. Pretend like you are going to go flying and look up all of the pertinent information for a certain area. Look up the METARs, look up the TAF, look at winds and temps aloft, look at the graphical area forecast, and just make, every day, just go through the flow of giving yourself a no-go decision. So that way you are always familiar with these weather products, so that you're always familiar with the things that a METAR might tell you. Because once you start reading a METAR often, you're going to start picking up on, there's some symbols and there's some abbreviations in there that I don't see often, but when they do pop up, I don't know what they mean. So the more often you do this, the more information you're going to start to retain. You're going to start to see more weather information, more weather products. And it's just going to help you be familiar with the weather, and it's going to make you a better pilot in assessing the weather at a quick glance. Another important piece of weather information that I think is more important now that you'll be an IFR pilot, an instrument pilot, is the PIREP, the pilot report. Again, this is something that this is a weather product that pilots produce, right? When you go flying and you experience either unforecasted weather or weather that was forecasted, but that's not there, it's helpful to all the other pilots to make a PIREP. So again, it's just something that I would highly recommend that you take some time, learn how to read a PIREP. Hopefully at this point you've learned how to read one, but now you should get into the practice of how do I make a PIREP. Okay, so I think even on ForeFlight, let me double check this real fast. If you go to Scratchpad, close that. If we do a new Scratchpad, yeah, there is a form for the PIREP. So as you can see, even in ForeFlight, they make it really easy for you to produce a PIREP for Flight Services or Center. So you can, write in, my location. I was over KPRC, the time, maybe it was 1700 Zulu. Maybe you were at 12,000 feet. You're flying a 172. And then you can go down and give, sky cover. It was overcast, visibility. It was about a half, whatever. And so you can go through and give all of the information that might be pertinent to other pilots. Because again, if something was unforecasted, we want other pilots to know about that. So especially if most common is things like turbulence, when you hit turbulence, icing is a big one, especially in IFR. I would want to know, right? If icing is not forecasted, if I'm flying in a cloud and it was forecasted to be warmer than freezing, I would plan to make that flight because I wasn't, there's no icing forecasted. But if in fact the temperature was lower than forecasted at that altitude and there is icing conditions, and maybe you fly through it and like, oh shoot, there's icing, you get out of it, you make a PIREP to alert other pilots that in this area there is in fact icing. So that's why it's extremely important to know how to fill one of these out, because as IFR pilots, you are flying into the weather. Even though you're rated to fly into the clouds, it still doesn't mean you're rated for strong turbulence or for icing, depending on your aircraft. So this is information that is important to you, and it's important to other pilots. So if we were in class together, I would have you practice decoding PIREPs with a partner and writing PIREPs. So if you can, maybe practice that in your own time. Maybe call up a classmate and something you can practice together, or practice. If you're flying, I would highly recommend maybe practicing this with your flight instructor. Okay, let's talk about in-flight weather services. When you're in the aircraft, as always, you can always call flight services. So in this case, looking at this VOR, we can see we can call Reno on 122.1 receiving. So we can always call flight services and get the most up-to-date weather information. So all you have to do is just figure out what is the closest flight service station, or what is the closest frequency that I can get flight services on. Another way you can get in-flight weather service is through HIWAS. So hopefully you learned about HIWAS in your private pilot training. But the thing with HIWAS is that it's soon to be gone. And I don't know the exact timeline for when it will officially be discontinued. But last spring, they officially announced that HIWAS was going to be phased out. So what HIWAS did provide is you could tune in to the VOR and listen on the VOR, and you could get your AirMet SIGMET information, convective SIGMET information, and center weather advisory information. But that information soon to be no longer available. But what you would want to look for, if it is still around, is that little H in the corner of the VOR information box. If you see that H, that means that VOR station, that ground station, has HIWAS, so you can dial in and listen. But like I said, it's being phased out, so don't expect it to be around much longer. Where you are probably going to see it is on your FAA knowledge test. The knowledge tests tend to be behind current practices, especially when it comes to weather, because weather information changes quickly just because we have all these new methods of getting weather information, that certain weather sources and products are being phased out. For example, the textual area forecast, I believe, is not produced anymore. I don't think you can find it at the aviationweather.gov, but it's still being tested on the FAA knowledge test. So that's just something you have to be careful of, is really pay attention. Whatever product you use to study for an FAA knowledge test, so in our case, Dauntless, really go in and really study the Dauntless section for weather, because you just never know what outdated weather source you're still being expected to test on. So I'm sure that you will still be expected to test on HIWAS, but it's being phased out in practice. So little tidbit there for you. Other in-flight weather services are Garmin G1000 with ADS-B provides certain weather information. So you can get radar, you can get METARs, you can get radar coverage, and you can get TAFs via the G1000. Great tool. This is a great resource to have in the airplane. It's really cool that you can look up METARs for airports as you're flying around in the airplane itself. So that's great information. Where you need to be cautious is that weather information that comes to the G1000 is not super up to date. It has kind of a delay, especially if you're looking at the radar. The radar image that you see only refreshes every 2.5 minutes. The METARs refresh every 5 minutes. Radar coverage refreshes every, again, 2.5 minutes, and then TAFs refresh every 10 minutes. So there is a chance that the information could get old quickly. So you should only reference it. It should not be a primary source for figuring out what the weather is doing. That being said, don't use the radar image as like a method to dodge the radar. So if we were kind of to go back, let's look up here. So if this is what you saw in your airplane, you might be tempted to think, ooh, I can shoot this gap right here. I can fly really fast. I can get out of here because this is what I'm seeing on my screen right now. But in reality, this image could be old and this gap could be filled in already by the time you make the decision. So that's why you can reference it, but don't use it as a method to skirt your way around a bad thunderstorm or a bad downpour, because the information can be old. So don't, just because you see it, you can kind of use it as a reference, an idea of what the weather might be doing, but don't trust it as for a situation like this, trying to shoot the gap to get between two thunderstorms. So again, a great resource. What I would do, how I would use it, is if I turned this on and I saw, let's say, like a big thunderstorm cloud or some precipitation on the radar, I would then call flight services over the radio and be like, hey, I see this on my G1000. Can you tell me about it? Can you give me more up-to-date, accurate information about what it's doing, as opposed to trusting your G1000? Because again, it doesn't refresh very quickly, so it's not very up-to-date. Again, if we were in class, I would have you do this activity where you would compile a standard weather briefing This is the standard way flight services would brief you on the weather if you called them. They would give you adverse conditions, VFR flight, either recommended or not recommended, a synopsis, current conditions, en route forecast, destination forecast, winds aloft, NOTAMs, and ATC delays. This is all outlined in the AIM 7, Chapter 7, 1-5, the pre-flight briefing section. So this is a great way to practice learning the weather, because this is how a briefer is going to give you the weather. I think a really good rule of thumb to have is you should collect weather in two ways. The first of which being is you collect it. So you go on to ForeFlight, you go on to aviationweather.gov, and you brief yourself on the weather. So you would just go through all these things, check adverse weather conditions. Should I go VFR? Should I go IFR? Give yourself a synopsis, go through this list, and then you should call the briefer. And ideally, what you would want is the briefer to tell you all of the same information that you just collected. So essentially, when you listen to the briefer giving you your brief, there should be no new information. It should all be stuff that you've learned before. And I think that's the way to create redundancy in your weather briefing. So that way nothing gets through the cracks. Maybe the briefer missed something. Maybe you missed something, so that you have this extra layer of, hey, I collected all the weather information. Here's what I figured out. Then I called a weather briefer. He or she told me all the information that I needed to know. Hey, and they're both the same. So I did a good job at analyzing the weather. So that's a good practice. I think that's a really good practice to get into. So that way, when you go flying, there shouldn't be any unforeseen weather events. Hopefully, you did a good job collecting the weather. The briefer did a good job explaining the weather, and there should be nothing left to chance. So good practice to get into. So that wraps up this lesson. Hopefully I didn't talk too much. Hopefully it was all review. So a lot of this should be review. But as always, if you have any questions, please shoot me an email. Hit me up on Canvas, or we can set up a Zoom call and go over this information more in depth. So I will see you guys next time.